I'll call to order the Thursday, March 25th, 2021 meeting of the Clive City Council. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Cirksena.
Here.
Council members Klein,
Here.
Edwards,
Here.
McCoy,
Here.
Judkins,
Here.
Weaver.
Here.
Nice to have everybody present and accounted for. Happy spring to all. Now, as is our tradition, we have a scout that leads us, a scout from Troop 208 that leads us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I'm not sure if Jackson Avery is here yet. If you are, please raise your hand. If you are not here, Matthew, I'm going to ask you to lead us.
One moment, Mayor. Let me see if I can identify Jackson. Jackson, are you able to raise your hand? I see I have one participant here who's. One moment. Your Honor, I still do not see the participant who I would be able to identify as the scout for this evening.
Well, let's go ahead and proceed then. If he comes on, we can recognize him a little bit later, but let's go ahead and keep going. Matthew, why don't you lead us in the pledge? Just to all, Matthew will be reciting the pledge and will be muted for sound quality.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Very good. Thank you, Matthew. Okay, next item is approval of the agenda. I'm not aware of any changes.
Move approval.
Second.
Moved by John, seconded by Eric. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
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 Those opposed?
Turn that light on for Dad, please. That one right there.
The agenda is approved. Okay, the next item is citizens presentation. Now, this is where any resident or business partner that's joining us in the meeting tonight would like to address the council on an item that is not on the agenda this evening. Is there anyone here to do so? And if so, please raise your hand in the chat box and make yourself known to Pete so he can plug you into us.
Folks, the best way to do that is to use the raise hand function. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see the participant icon. If you click on it, a separate window will open up and you will see able to raise your hand. For people participating on the phone, and I believe it's just Chief Rowe tonight, so Chief, I could text you the directions if you want to raise your hand and also unmute you from where I'm sitting. I've also, for the typing in, enabled the chat function. If you'd like to just send me a chat note, my name is Pete D. Cook, and that will get my attention as well. Mayor, at this time, I do not see any hands going up.
Seeing none, we'll move to our first scheduled item this evening, and that's a presentation. We're so glad to have State Representative Jennifer Conforst with us this evening. Representative, welcome. Nice to see you, and know things are moving fast at the State House, so we look forward to your update and appreciate you taking the time to do so. So again, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone. As I said to Mr. Mayor, it's very nice to see friendly faces. Every face of the Capitol right now is not friendly, whether we're on the same side or not. We're just cranky and tired right now. It's been a very long week. But I will just update you on a few things that I know your team has contacted me about. I do want to say first and foremost that you are so very well served by Matt and Pete. They are both very good at reaching out to us with issues that matter and good detail and good context. And so it's been really helpful to me because if there's a bill I'm not sure about yet, if I hear about it from Matt and Pete, it really helps me to focus and understand the impact on the community that I serve. So very grateful for that. A few things that that you have reached out to me about that I wanted to give you an update on. I just heard this week regarding the tax increment finance bill, the one that would remove the distinction for slum and blight TIF and caps all new TIFs at 20 years. We have not had that bill come up yet, but it is currently, I think, in Ways or just passed out of Ways and will be eligible. I'm not supportive of that legislation. I typically, if there's a local control issue, whenever possible, I try to oppose that legislation just because, I do serve 3 communities that have very strong and very active and very capable city councils who are perfectly capable of deciding what you need to do on your own. So as often as I can, I try to support local control whenever I can. And so clearly TIFs are a good tool, an important tool that you use. And I don't believe that this is a piece that's necessary. There's also a piece out there right now, a bill that's in the Senate or that came out of the Senate, maybe. It came out of the Senate regarding censorship of big tech companies and not allowing us to provide tax breaks, things like that to companies that censor speech. Some of you may know that I'm a trained journalist and I teach in the journalism program at Drake. And so First Amendment issues are pretty important to me. So even if this wasn't a pretty obvious swipe at local control, I would be against it because I don't believe that you should be punishing companies for making business decisions, which is what these are. These aren't restrictions on speech, they're business decisions. And so I'm opposed to that bill as well. So we have seen a lot of things happen up at the Capitol with regard to local control and with regard to taking away local control. And that continues to concern me. We've done a lot of other things that are great. You hear a lot about the fights because they're a lot more interesting, but we get along and we do a lot of things on a bipartisan basis, and a lot of legislation passes that way. Today we passed a bill that I love that is a compromise between the business community and adoptive parents. It requires businesses to provide the same leave benefits for new adoptive parents as it does for parents who have a biological child, and up to age 6. And I certainly know that there are kids who are older who get adopted out of the foster care system, and I'd love for them to be able to stay home families to be able to stay home for longer. But we heard the business community, and so this is a compromise there. We passed that out unanimously today, and it's just one example of a lot of what we do up there is bipartisan and unanimous in nature, and so that's always nice to remind people of too. I know that there had been some question about the tax bill that was just introduced in the Senate that addresses the property tax backfill. And I can talk about that. I can answer any questions you have, but I did a little bit of research today. And if I look at the Department of Management calculator, it looks like Clive gets about $500,000. The city does from the backfill, and West Des Moines Schools gets about 2.4 million from that. And so I am not a fan of getting rid of the backfill. I know we've heard a lot about, well, it wasn't supposed to be a permanent solution, and it was a bridge, and I just don't feel that we're at the phase yet where we can just leave cities high and dry by getting rid of this backfill. And so I think now is not the time to phase out that commitment. We made a commitment to you as a state, but I don't think that we should be going back on the promise to cities when that was made. So and then the only other note I have is that the American Rescue Plan, it looks to me like, and you know this better than I do, that Clive is getting 2.39 million from the American Rescue Plan, and West Des Moines Schools is eligible for 8.5 million. So just in terms of what's coming in at a federal level. So I could go on and on. I've got, pages and pages, but I won't. As Professor Edwards knows, I can speak in hour and 15-minute increments. So, if you'd like me to do that as a professor, I will. But Mr. Mayor, I think I'll turn it over to questions if that's all right with you.
Well, thank you, Representative. You touched on some areas that I think are very important to us, and I'm going to open it up to council for questions or comments. Council, don't be shy. Jump in here.
Well, I will. I'd like to first just congratulate Representative Compost on being selected a leader. I think it's great to hear about our city being well represented by our staff, but we're certainly well represented at the State House by you. And I'm personally interested in an issue that's actually already passed the House, but wondering about conversations related to gun control. especially with some of the recent revelations related to COVID-19 and psychosis that are occurring unexpectedly in some individuals. It seems like a really important time to kind of slow down the time to be able to acquire a firearm. So are you expecting the governor to give consideration to that at all?
So thank you for your kind words. I appreciate it. Yeah, being the minority whip is oftentimes rewarding and oftentimes frustrating. So, but I'm honored to be up there and be able to bring the Polk County and the Western Suburbs voice to the table. You know, if you're referencing the permitless carry bill that just passed, I know we've heard a lot of talk about it being constitutional carry. Technically, it is not constitutional carry. It is in many ways constitutional carry, but it's not. So I've had a lot of people request that exact phrase, and it's not quite there. And I don't think that even the bill sponsors would say it's exactly that, but it does eliminate the requirement to have a permit to carry or purchase a weapon from an Iowa licensed dealer. Still have to have a background check and have a permit if you purchase it from, or have a background check if you purchase it from a federally licensed gun dealer. So, you know, I did vote against this bill. I had concerns regarding many of the things you're talking about, Susan. We have not been keeping up with funding for mental health services. And so I'm concerned about a lack of adequate funding for mental health, and the connection to making guns a little easier to get. There are a lot of loopholes that this builds, I believe, including domestic violence loopholes. And I had some amendments that I added to the bill, that I tried to add to the bill, one of which would have that was for a different bill. That was for the immunity bill, but that would have made it so that a gun dealer is not immune from prosecution if they sell a gun to a person who's obviously in psychosis or clearly intoxicated or things like that. So we tried to kind of make that better, and it was it was not successful. It did pass. Do I know if the governor will sign it? I don't know. I can only assume that she will. She has not been signing things immediately when they go down to her, but has been signing them. So oftentimes those get signed on Friday. So we'll see what happens tomorrow.
Eric, you had a question. Go ahead.
Thank you. Representative Khan, first, the 411 system, or the municipal fire and police retirement system, is incredibly expensive for cities like Clive right here. It's also inequitable as far as how much we're expected to fund that. Do you see any reform in that system, and what will you do specifically to help address that?
So thank you. Yeah, the 411 system is one that I hear about a lot from you, and I know that our state government colleague, I'm on the state government committee, which deals with the 411 bill. And so I've looked, sorry, I froze. I was afraid I froze for a second. We had a bill that came out that, from what I understood, was somewhat acceptable compromise to cities when it came to it. Put a cap on the number of years you could file to 5 years after, and there was one other provision that it passed state government, and let me flag it and look it up. I think that it passed the full House. We're doing like 40 bills a week. So, so anyway, my point is that, we're trying to find that balance between making sure that, we're taking care of our employees in the cities, and we're not putting too much burden on the cities. So I've been talking with Chairman Kaufman on the state government committee, and with the League of Cities lobbyists who are up at the Capitol, to see where this bill stands and what's on it. I will tell you that we were told that the bill that passed out of state government in the House was one that did represent, though it wasn't what cities wanted, it was at least more acceptable to cities and was a compromise versus the bill that originally came out for 411. So we'll continue to look at ways to more creatively fund these things. I'm well aware, I have 3 cities, as I've mentioned, all have shared with me their concerns about 411 funding. And, Chairman Kaufman, a Republican from Cedar County, is the one who's on this bill, and he works closely with these issues and does a lot of the negotiation. So I try to touch base with him, but I'll kind of see where that ended up. But for now, just know that we're continuing to look for new ways to burden shift a little bit and burden share.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Representative, you had mentioned in your previous comments about you mentioned mental health, and I believe the tax bill that's coming up in the Senate provides more funding for mental health. I think 60 million the first year, maybe up to 160 million, the next year. I think I have that right. You probably have better detail than I do, but what are your thoughts about that? To me, it seems like a pretty nice jump from the roughly 30 million that the governor proposed in the State of the State address of 15 million and 15 million over 2 years. So interested in your thoughts on that, and do you think the bill makes that not so much a one-time type funding, but a stable level of funding, which seems to be the biggest issue?
That's a good question. Mental health funding is pretty complex in the state of Iowa, as you all well know, and counties bear a lot of the burden on this. And so I want to, we talked about the bill a little bit today that is heading our way. Look, I'm all for additional funding for mental health. I want to make sure it goes directly to the people who need it. I want to make sure that we're providing rural mental health services, that we're providing residencies. I know psychiatric residencies are really low in the state. And so whatever way we can get to actually, bringing more providers into the state, making sure parity is there so that we hear a lot of times that there are mental health providers who choose to work in Omaha versus Council Bluffs, for example, because they can get the same quality of life, but get better reimbursement rates across the river. So, we're looking at the whole picture here. With regard to this, I think more stable funding is a good idea. And I am happy to see that the Senate bill does have more of that in it. I'm a little concerned about where it's coming from and what impact that will have on the counties. And so I'm reserving judgment right now, if that's all right. But I will tell you that, we all agree, I know, in the House, across party lines, that increased funding for mental health is critically important and long overdue. And I believe there are Republicans and Democrats alike in the House who were disappointed by the 15 and 15. So we're also looking for additional ways to fund mental health in the state of Iowa. In addition to, Susan mentioned, COVID related mental health issues. Kids are having mental health issues, through the roof right now because of COVID and isolation and quarantine and all of that. It's just been a really rough year for everyone. And so now is the time to invest more, not less. And we do have a budget surplus without going into the reserves. And so I think that this would be a good time to use those.
Well, thank you for keep up your good work there. I certainly appreciate that. Council members, a couple more questions for the representative. Anything?
I don't have a question, Mayor. I just wanted to thank her for joining us tonight, busy schedule and all, and I appreciate you filling us in on some of the happenings down there.
Thank you, Michael. I do feel bad. I was scheduled to be on the last one, but just couldn't do it. But I think this might have worked out so that you can have someone this week too to give an update 2 weeks later. And like I said, we were there until 1 this morning and then gavelled back in, or I had a subcommittee meeting at 8. So it's possible I have not said any words that make any sense tonight because I'm very tired, but we'll see. Maybe I made some sense. But I do want to let you know that there are, and I also want to thank, the police department and the fire department and everybody. When we have a question, I'm able to make a call. It is incredibly helpful to me because, oftentimes we have people who represent 2 or 3 counties up at the Capitol. And so they'll say, well, I've called my 3 county attorneys on my 14 cities, right? Or my 14 communities. And it's just nice that I have 3 really solid, really responsive, really engaged city staff and councils, because it's the easiest thing in the world to be like, oh, my city council's against it. Great. Unless I can find another reason or I've got sort of a different take on it, which doesn't happen very often. I think you'll find it's a nice way for me to say my city wants it, so we're going to go for it. So I do want to say, and I told Matt and Pete this, I did introduce a bill this year that was a bill that prohibited cities from doing a breed specific ban for dogs. And that was a constituent request. And I wanted to make sure that I told you when I filed that bill, because I didn't want anyone to think that I talk about local control and then I filed a bill that takes away local control. I did it as a constituent request. I knew that it would in advance, but I wanted to serve a constituent who really felt this was important. So thanks for understanding that and for getting back to me on that.
Well, and you let us know that too. So, well, Representative, thank you. And to Michael's point, know how busy you are. Congratulations on your leadership. I think it's taking well to you.
Thank you.
And best of luck for the rest of a productive session. And I know that it will be. based on what we're seeing. So Godspeed.
Thank you.
We'll look forward to updates from you in the near future.
Thank you. Please continue to stay in touch. It's good to see everyone.
Will do. Thank you. Okay, council, the next item is consent items.
Move the resolution.
Second.
Moved by John, seconded by Eric. Do I have that right? Wasn't looking. Okay. Moved by John, seconded by Eric. Any discussion? Seeing none, will the council please vote? Passes 5-0. Thank you. Okay, now we'll move down to action items. The first action item 1 is a public hearing amending the provisions of Title 10 building regulations of the city of Clive regarding fire codes. And Matthew, did we post appropriate public notice?
Yes, Your Honor, it was published in the Des Moines Register on March 12th, 2021.
Thank you, Matthew. Clay, you're going to take us through this one.
Thank you, Your Honor, City Council. Let me get this pulled up. How are we looking here? Is that the right screen?
There we go. Yep, we can see it.
All right. So I want to take you through some of the proposed new International Fire Code, the 2018 edition of the Fire Code adoption. What I really focused on in this adoption was getting rid of any duplication that we had in reviewing our previous city fire code. I found that there was a ton of duplication within the fire code, the building code. So I worked closely with Ryan to eliminate pretty much the duplication. So I'm going to cover what I think is some of the significant updates to the code. So I'll take you through these. If you got any questions, please stop me. So section 113.8 covers our negligent false alarms. This was a new addition to our code. And this is the fee structure. So we defined a negligent false alarm as any alarm where an alarm clock contractor is on site doing work to an alarm system. So prior to any contractor doing work, they're supposed to put the alarm on test. That's the standard across the board. They all know that. A lot of the alarms that we run are contractor errors. So that contractor did not put that system on test. So out of the gate, we're going to fine them fairly heavily. I believe that these contractors, it's their responsibility to know the system and to know and perform the work appropriately. So implementing this new fee structure will reduce our false alarm calls, especially to these this type of negligent alarm.
Clay, can you clarify that for me? You are finding the contractor, not the owner, correct?
No, we're not. So there was some legislation that was passed not too long ago where we are not allowed to fine the contractor. So I apologize if that's what I said. The fee and the fine will actually go to the business owner. So there was a lot of behind the scenes work when that passed, and I don't really know the history of that too well, but I do know that the fines will go directly to the property owner, not the contractor. So in my history thus far, I think we pack a bigger punch that way, because when I call these alarm contractors, they're fearful that they're going to lose work. So by finding the property owner, it's actually I think it's going to hold a bigger punch too. So I'm happy with it.
I get that, but let's just use, for example, Christina, if you wouldn't mind. Let's say we're setting up, the new police station, and the contractor trips that a couple times. Is there even any way we can go after that contractor, or do we just eat that cost? And if it's, of us, is there any other? I guess it depends on the contract you sign with these folks, but it's a bit directed. I get it with legislation, but at the wrong person.
Yeah, I'm happy to pipe in on that. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, most of your contracts, at least with respect to the public safety facility, you're going to have an indemnification clause in there where you're able to seek, compensation back from that contractor or whatever party it was that caused that additional expense or cost. And I anticipate that most owners have those sorts of relationships in their contracts, but it is going to be based on the contract. From a collection perspective, I actually agree with Clay too, that, not only is this the law now, but it does make sense from a accountability perspective on collection for the city.
Yeah, I recently had one with a fairly large property, and the contractor was begging for the fine to pay it personally, so it didn't get to the contractor. They were fearful that they were going to lose some business over it. So I think this is a pretty good one and should definitely help out the fire department. So section 115, we added some verbiage in here that will require all of our life safety plans over a certain threshold to be reviewed by a fire protection engineer. This is a huge time savings for the fire department, puts another set of eyes on a set of plans, and it gets a very thorough review of that by a fire protection engineer. Our some changes to our outdoor fire, section 307.2. The old rule was really based on the preparation of food. The new rule requires a device that will accommodate the preparation of food. Really what changed that was just a couple words. And then the impact, it's easier for the fire department, the police department, and the DNR air quality control to regulate that. So they can accommodate, or they can enforce the device rather than an action. An action was much more difficult to enforce. Section 903.2.1 is in relation to our sprinkler thresholds. This would be the square footage requirement that we as a fire department would require a certain building to sprinkler it. And looking at the numbers, these are a couple of our more common buildings that are coming in. And if you look at the numbers here, you'll see that we were at 45, and now we put it at 6,000 square feet. So these numbers here are in line with all of our metro cities. We were out of line prior to this new code adoption, and we feel that this is a standard across the board throughout the entire metro. So that's why you see some changes here. It's just creating a more standardized sprinkler threshold throughout the metro. Last but not least, questions.
Well, we've had some discussion. Council, additional questions here for Clay.
I've got one, Clay.
Yes, sir.
Could you go back on the open fires? I've had several residents talk to me about those. Can you just, they want to do some type of backyard, fire pit, or those devices you buy that have the lid on it, or the grate kind of dome lid. I mean, that seems reasonable to me. Can they use that in this model?
So yes. So here's a little fact sheet that we put together to answer these types of questions here. So we initiate, or we put some new verbiage in there to regulate the device and the components of what that device is. But as you can see here, if we meet the criteria of getting the fire off of the ground, allowing for airflow, if we're regulating the size of our wood to keep our fire under a relatively controllable size, and a couple other things. But the biggest change that you'll see in this is the accommodation of the preparation of food. The old code stated that you had to be preparing food. So the classic, I have a pack of hot dogs sitting next to me, you are okay to do that per the old code. We know full well you are not using that device to prepare food, but you kind of found the loophole in the system. The new code allows you as a property owner to utilize your grill if it meets the criteria that we have listed out here and do that. So the grate and accommodation of the preparation of food is the big change with this.
I like that. Thank you.
Clay, can you elaborate on item E, which about the smoke there, that it shall not exit the user's property at or below the user's roof line?
Yeah, so a lot of the calls that we get with burns is simply your neighbor and the smoke coming into your neighbor's property. So we felt adding some regulation in there as to how the smoke exits your property was very important. So this way you're being a responsible neighbor, and if the wind is right, if there's humidity in the air, so on and so forth, and you're meeting the criteria, but if the smoke is exiting the fire into your neighbor's house, that's an enforceable item that the fire department or the police department can take an action on and tell you to put your fire out. You're being a bad neighbor. So that's the smoke exiting the roof line.
Thank you. Council, additional questions? Otherwise, I'd take a motion to close the public hearing.
Move to close the public hearing.
It's moved by Ted, seconded by Eric to close the public hearing. But before we do, if there's anybody here to speak on this item, please raise your hand in the chat and advise Pete so he can connect you to us.
If you do want to speak, please go ahead and identify yourself at this time via chat or the raise hand function. Mayor, I do not see any hands going up.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to close the public hearing. Seeing no further discussion, will the council please vote? That passes 5-0 to close the public hearing, and we're looking for the first reading tonight.
Your Honor, could I just make one comment? I went ahead and voted for that, but after hearing the explanation of the smoke being below the neighbor's roof line, I'm wondering what happens if a stray gust of wind kind of shows up. You might have had a fire going, all of a sudden it's changeable, kind of not through any fault of the person. It all of a sudden went below. There seems to be, to me, there should be some provision for that.
Clay?
Yeah, I think going back to a good neighbor, but I think as a responsible resident, if we're out enjoying a fire that meets all the required code, and then, we do get a wind that's now blowing into our neighbor's property, I think as part of being a good neighbor, we as the fire department and police department have a means to enforce you to be required to put that out. All of our code, I try to really keep the good neighbor idea in. And if we're not, bothering our neighbor and we're being safe and responsible, I'm all for it. But I think that's kind of where we felt the smoke exiting was very important. So.
No, I think that's a good point. I just hate to see someone fined if it, was just, they took steps to put it out as that started to happen. I just think we're going to have a lot of education on that.
Well, and Clay, to your point, I think that if the department arrives at a fire scene, like we're talking about, hopefully discussion with the neighbor has been going on, or people would be brought together, and that best of judgment by the department would also be used in those conversations as well before citing anyone. So I think we want to avoid, if we get a gust of wind or whatever, and then someone's getting cited. So we don't want to have the punitive side of it, but I think we want to be a good neighbor and make sure everybody's communicating before anybody's cited for anything. That would be that's how I'm reading this. Is that accurate? Okay, good. I'm seeing heads nod. I would, and again, this is the first of 3 readings, so we can continue to discuss it. I'd take a motion.
I'd move that ordinance number 1101, having been considered by the council, be voted on for passage prior to its final adoption.
Second.
Moved by Michael, seconded by Ted. Further discussion? Seeing none, will the council please vote? That passes 5-0, the first reading. Thank you. Thank you, Clay.
Thank you.
Okay, the second public hearing is regarding the FY 21-22 budget. And Matthew, did we post appropriate public notice?
A notice was published March 8th, 2021 in the Des Moines Register.
Thank you, Matthew. Joyce, you're going to take us through this one.
Yes, good evening, Mayor and Council. What we have before you tonight would be the resolution that approves the fiscal year 21-22 budget based on the direction you provided us in the work sessions that we've had this year. We put it in final form. The public hearing notice was published as required, and we have to date not received any comments on the budget. So subject to any questions you guys might have, open to.
I would just make a comment that we've made this process so efficient that you know, seeing this come up again seems like almost ancient news. So I think a great job by everybody, staff and council, for the sixth straight year in a row, keeping our levy at $10.14 and doing it very judiciously, and for our AAA bond rating and all of our accomplishments as it surrounds this budget and our governance and our work with council and staff. Other questions or comments, council?
Your Honor, if I
Public
may
hearing.
add really quickly, Your Honor.
Yeah, Matt, go ahead, and then John will move over to you.
Yes, sorry about that. Yeah, I just wanted to add in terms of just what we're able to accomplish with this budget in terms of making investments and training and kind of almost promotional opportunities within our Public Works Department, which was a key piece of this. Also, the kind of protection that we're doing financially from working through the pandemic, also understanding that we're not quite through the pandemic, and that, you know, there's sufficient reserves in place for the city to be flexible with what the future may hold. Also, there'll be funding opportunities coming down the line, whether that might be from federal stimulus or other opportunities, that this budget definitely well positions us as a city to take advantage of those opportunities. And the one quick thing that I wanted to throw in here, and just an appreciation to all the staff who put this together and the work that they did to kind of vet requests and doing their research, but particularly I want to mention Joyce, as this will be the last budget that she sees all the way through in her time and career here at the city of Clive, with retiring at the end of the year. And so I wanted to be sure to recognize the hours, many hours of work that she puts into putting this document together for you, and going through these presentations and working with department heads on their requests and vetting those. And so particularly wanted to mention Joyce and my thanks for all of her work with the budgets she's developed over a number of years here in Clive.
Matt, very appropriate remarks. And Joyce, I wish we could just mandate that you can't retire. I really do. But
Thanks,
we're so grateful. Thank you.
Thank you.
John, you had a question or a comment?
I was going to move to close the public hearing.
Second.
Second? From anyone?
Second.
Eric.
Moved by John, seconded by Eric to close the public hearing. Further discussion? Before we do close it, is there anybody here to speak on this item? If so, please raise your hand in the chat box. Make yourself known to Pete so he can plug you into us.
I do not see any hands going up.
Seeing none, will the council please vote? Passes 5-0 to close the public hearing.
Move the resolution approving the FY 21-22 budget.
Second.
Moved by John, seconded by Eric. Further discussion? Seeing none, will the council please vote? And that passes 5-0. Thank you. Thank you, Joyce.
Yes. Thank
and
you.
all of us who worked to put this great budget together. That is approved. Okay, item number 3 is proposed utility rate adjustments for FY22. We've got 3 first considerations here. Joyce, if you'd carry us through that one.
Yes. So as a result of our budget discussions and what we have prepared in the budget, we, at this point in time, usually as soon as we get the budget adopted, we move forward with getting those new rates in place. So the first one for the water rates, it incorporates a 3% increase for the upcoming fiscal year. The sewer rates would be a 2% increase, and the stormwater rates 10% increase. So that is how we've prepared the ordinances. And then as we get these ordinances approved and go through the 3 readings, they will go into effect May 15th. For that billing that runs May 15 to June 15, the bills that go out July 1. So then our revenue coming in after July 1 will be at the new rate. And if anybody's got any questions, happy to answer those.
Thank you, Joyce. I think a lot of conversation on this topic over time. Council questions for Joyce? I think we're going to keep Councilmember McCoy busy for the next couple of minutes.
Wow, I just read it beautifully just a couple of seconds ago. I'll try it again though, off mute. Move that ordinance number 1102 pertaining to water rates having been considered by the council be voted on for passage prior to its final adoption.
Second.
Moved by Michael, seconded by Susan. Further discussion? Seeing none, will the council please vote? That passes 5-0.
Move that ordinance number 1103 pertaining to sewer rates having been considered by the council be voted on for passage prior to its final adoption.
Second.
Moved by Michael, seconded by Susan. Further discussion? Seeing none, will the council please vote? That item passes 5-0.
Move that ordinance number 1104 pertaining to stormwater rates having been considered by the council be voted on for passage prior to its final adoption.
Second.
Moved by Michael, seconded by Susan. Further discussion? Seeing none, will the council please vote? And that passes 5-0. Thank you, Joyce. And yes, Michael, I agree. That sounded much better and clearer off mute. Okay, we'll move to action item number 4, which is regarding general obligation corporate purpose bonds, series 2021A, and general obligation urban renewal public safety bonds, series 2021B. Joyce, you're going to take us through this one. We're getting our money's worth today from you.
Yeah.
And we have some great news this afternoon as it relates to the issuance of these bond packages. So please give us the details.
Yeah, we certainly did. And actually, I am going to let Suzanne lead us through the details. But it was a very exciting day, and we had a great sale day. And I'm appreciative of all of the help that PFM and the other staff do to help us get all of this together. So I will let Suzanne share the great news with you.
All right, good evening. All right, good evening, Mayor and Council. I am joining you from the offices at 801 Grand downtown tonight. I'm happy to report that for the Series 2021A bonds that we received 5 bids from 26 different firms today. The true interest cost bids ranged from 1.007% to a high of 1.21%. The winning bid today was received from Robert W. Baird with over 21 members in the selling group out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin at a true interest cost of 1.007%. The net interest cost, just $162,000. These are 10-year bonds that have the city's AAA rating on them. This year, the city is non-bank qualified, so to be at 1% for the next 10 years is tremendous. There was a premium on these bonds today. The city opted to keep the premium, and we'll reevaluate this fall and see if we need to reduce the borrowing for the next fiscal year. But at 1%, it was just too good of a rate to pass up at that premium. So around $400,000 of premium on the 21A bonds. The city priced just 11 basis points over MMD. And this 21A bonds will be paid for by the debt service levy, and the city will be consistent at the $1.48 debt service levy rate. If we want to move on to the 21B bonds, the 21B bonds are the third and final phase of the funding for the Clive Public Safety Facility. Again, the Moody's AAA rating was applied to these bonds, and these bonds are actually 19-year bonds. So when we talk about the rates, say, remember municipal bonds price over that yield curve. And so, you know, year 1 has the lowest rate, year 19 having the highest rate. We received 4 bids from 25 different firms on the Series 21B, with the true interest cost ranging from 1.64% to 1.93%. Today's winning bid on the B bonds was received from Northland Securities out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, at the true interest cost of 1.64%. So that is 19-year bonds, $5 million of 19-year bonds at 1.64%, tremendous pricing. And that was just 27 basis points over MMD. And the difference between the A series and the B series being the 10-year maturity on the A versus the 19-year maturity on the B, still just pricing over 27 basis points over MMD, just tremendous pricing. And these bonds, again, will be paid for by local option sales tax revenues. You know, I just want to say congratulations to the city of Clive. Your AAA continues to serve you very well, and the budget you just passed continues to prove that you take your fiscal responsibility very seriously as a city. So I just want to say congratulations, and at this time I'm happy to answer any questions that the council may have.
Well, thank you, council. Questions or comments? Well, Suzanne, thank you for your great work and for helping us carry out 2 very important sales for the city of Clive. Joyce, thank you as well. Any other additional comments, Suzanne or Joyce?
I have none, Your Honor.
Resolution approving the GO Corporate Purpose Bonds Series 2021A.
Second.
Moved by John, seconded by Eric. Further discussion? Seeing none, will the council please vote? That passes 5-0.
And I'd move the resolution awarding the sale of GO Urban Renewal Public Safety Facility Bond Series 2021B.
Second.
Moved by John, seconded by Eric. Further discussion? Seeing none, will the council please vote? And that item passes 5-0. Thank you, council. Thank you, Joyce and Suzanne. Great work.
Very well.
Okay, we'll move to the 5th action item now, which is the second consideration of zoning ordinance number 1099, amendment regarding signs. And Amanda.
Mayor, Council, good evening. As the mayor stated, tonight we have the second consideration of the 3-year review update for the sign ordinance from the last major changes that were made in 2018. At your last meeting, the only area that we kind of had some back and forth on left remaining to discuss was on the non-commercial speech temporary signs. Just as a reminder, that is any sign that would be temporary in nature that isn't directly commercial related speech. So political signs, social issue signs, celebratory signs. There's a lot of things that fall under that category now. And what staff heard from council was that you guys were interested in allowing those full-size barn signs, which are approximately 32-ish square feet on residential properties. So we have changed the language in the ordinance to show up to 70 square foot maximum on residential properties with no individual sign exceeding 35 square feet. Excuse me. Our previous ordinance before 2018, I did look back at that language. We did not have a size limit for political signs. However, we can no longer single out political signs specifically. It has to fall into this non-commercial speech sign type category. So it's a little broader than that. We did previously show at the last meeting an option for no size limit on those temporary signs, but both from council and from planning and zoning commission, we kind of heard that you guys would prefer a limit be placed on those signs, so we didn't get too out of control with what people might do. At this point, staff has not received any comments from the public. So if you guys have any questions or would like to discuss further this sign area for the temporary signs, I'm taking questions.
Council, questions or discussions for Amanda?
My only question is, Your Honor, and Amanda, would this put us in alignment with our neighboring jurisdictions?
For the most part, our neighboring jurisdictions have not actually updated to be in compliance with the 2015 Supreme Court case. So the only one of our neighbors that had changed theirs for the most part was West Des Moines. This would leave us allowing individual signs about twice the size that West Des Moines ordinance says they allow. Overall area on residential properties, it would be approximately the same. There's a 64 square feet, but their other sign limit is 32, where ours is 35. So instead of doubling 32 to get 64, you double 35 to get 70, but it's comparable.
Other questions? Councilmember McCoy?
I'd move that ordinance number 1099, having been considered by the council, be voted on for passage prior to its final adoption.
Second.
It's moved by Michael, seconded by Susan. Further discussion? Seeing none, will the council please vote? And that item passes 5-0. That's the second consideration. Thank you, Amanda. All right, we'll move to item number 6, which is the second consideration of ordinance number 1100, amending the provisions of Title 10 building regulations of the city of Clive regarding building, electrical, plumbing, energy conservation, mechanical, fuel, gas, and existing building codes. Ryan.
Mayor, Council, thank you for your time tonight. March 11th, we went through the public hearing, covered a lot of ground with regards to building codes and trade codes. I do want to open this up. If you want me to go back and review any of those sections with you, I certainly can do that. Since the public hearing, we have not received any additional comments or public feedback regarding the code adoptions. So I'll open it up to any questions, or we can go back and review anything that you would like. Just let me know.
Thank you, Ryan. Questions for Ryan, council? Hearing none, this is the second consideration.
Move that ordinance number 1100, having been considered by the council, be voted on for passage prior to its final adoption.
Second.
Moved by Michael, seconded by Susan. Further discussion? Seeing none, will the council please vote? And that passes 5-0. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll move down to discussion items now. We have 2 of those. The first one is regarding mobile food unit discussion. And Matthew, you're going to highlight for us.
Yeah, I'll lead off the conversation. I'll probably bring Doug Olendike in here momentarily. I'd like to preface it with, we started this ordinance back in 2017, and being the kind of the boots on the ground staff that works on this, I would like to report back that over the last 4 years, this has been a tremendously successful program. In working with the food truck vendors over the years, I've received nothing but positive feedback. They like the way our ordinance is written. They like the freedom that it allows them to operate, and it gives them well-defined parameters to operate within. So I just want to say that to get the conversation started, that this is a success. So having said that, we've recently come up with some unique scenarios that we would like some council guidance on, and that is specifically, what do we do with a food truck that wants to operate on vacant property? When we first drafted the first round of this ordinance, I had put in there that we would not allow this to take place. Kind of seeing that this could be a management nightmare for staff. But it was the council's desire at that time to put in a provision to allow for it in some limited capacity, which we did. And over the last 4 years, nobody has asked to get permission to operate on vacant property. However, recently we've had a food truck vendor set up on some vacant land on 86th Street. So we've addressed that through code enforcement and have brought to the attention of that food truck operator that they do need permission to operate there, which they've asked for. But before staff kind of goes down that road, we would really like to have a conversation with council to see what kind of guidelines do you want us to employ? There, Matt has brought up the specific section of code that says that no mobile food unit may be located on a vacant property or a lot with a vacant building, with exceptions can be granted by city staff. We kind of put in some guidelines in there that say that if you can provide safe and sanitary conditions, access to restrooms, those sorts of things, those are what staff is going to be looking at. But we would like some more guidance from council. Is there anything else that you would like us to look at? Specifically, this lot that they're set up on is multiple acres and could potentially host 50, 60, 70 food trucks on it. Is that something you want to see in the community? So those are the kinds of things staff is struggling with right now, and we would like to really get council's feedback on. And I know Doug has some more concerns coming from the community perspective and how it impacts other kind of brick and mortar businesses. So that's where I'm going to start it off with, and I'd like to hand it over to Doug to give his input. And council, please just interject as you see fit. Let's have a conversation.
Matthew, thanks. As you transition to Doug, I'd start with they need to ask permission first.
That is correct. Yeah. And this,
Just
they did.
Walking
they
and
put the-
tackling, right?
Yeah. The cart went before the horse on this one, and we're dealing with that. They're very cooperative with it. We brought it to their attention that they may have to pack up and move, and it may not be allowed. But before we wanted to drop the hammer down on them, we wanted to really have this conversation first, because I don't know what's council's desire. Do we want to go down this road or do we not?
Right, sure.
Once we go down this road, it's hard to go back.
Hey, Matthew, I have a quick question.
Yes, sir.
Did they have a license from the city? Are they a licensed vendor? Have they gone through that process and been vetted by your department?
Yes, they did. They did receive their license. They paid for it. They were inspected. They received a fire inspection. They were good to go in my book. They did receive full information about where they were and were not allowed to vend at. So they should have known that this was not permissible without permission. So that's on them, but it was a great time for us to kind of broach the subject of let's talk about this before we decide what we're going to do about it. Yes, it's within our purview to get them out of there right now.
Second
Yep.
question for you. So they did not receive permission to operate on this vacant land. I did notice in the pictures that they'd utilized, they were plugged into electrical box or something of that nature to provide electricity.
They are actually,
Eric's question, if I may, just I mean, did they ask the property owner?
Yeah.
they have a lease.
Just didn't ask us, or how did that work?
That is privately owned property, and they do have an agreement with the property owner.
Okay.
They're paying rent essentially on that property, which is why staff is concerned that if it's lucrative to rent out parcels of this property to food trucks, what would prevent the property owner from doing this with 50 or 60 more trucks, and thus incentivizing them not to develop that property?
Yeah, absolutely. Eric, and I kind of piggybacked on your question. Did you have anything more there?
No, Mayor, that's where I was going. I thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Doug, go ahead.
I would just really weigh in on kind of the community perspective on this. And, you know, I know certainly over the years, we've been working towards trying to be more accommodating of our business partners, which I certainly understand. The issue or concern that we would present from a community development standpoint is both a short term, and then Matthew kind of alluded to the longer term, which is, does this provide some disincentive potentially towards an actual development of the property? But more specifically, the concern is really on the short-term perspective. Community character is certainly something that we continue to have a strong interest in. And the use of property in a temporary capacity is something we've generally not allowed throughout our community. So we do have a question of equity in our mind in terms of allowing this particular property with a temporary mobile food unit versus other property, other commercial property where someone may just simply want to park on the grass or take a temporary sales area here or there or wherever it might be. You know, it's a situation, unfortunately, where in this case, one application isn't probably overly problematic, but it is going to be very challenging, as Matthew alluded to. Once you allow one, how do you say no to the number two? Or how do you say no to the person that wants to set up shop at the former Come and Go on 156th Street or one of the other properties in our community that may be in transition? So that's really the primary concern from our perspective, is just making sure that we're all on the same page in terms of our expectations, and so that we can clearly and definitively communicate with our partners, whether they're temporary or brick and mortar, to be able to communicate effectively with those folks that we're all working on the same team and working off the same level of expectation.
That's great. Thank you. I'm glad you brought that to us. I'm really interested in this discussion, so let's open it up.
Yeah, so Doug, you bring up a lot of good points, and certainly ones I would not have thought of on my own, and certainly opens my eyes to some potential issues. But when you say disincentivizing development, I mean, how long has that property owner owned that property there on 86th Street?
Longer than I've been with the city. The Ruan property, Ruan has owned that property for a long time. There used to be a Burger King on it, for those of you that remember.
Yeah.
That's been gone now for probably almost 15 years, probably.
Right. So I don't know how much we're actually disincentivizing development, certainly in that location. And like 156th Street, you know, I mean, personally, I think a temporary food truck, certainly not something that's there every day for a year or whatever, but just something temporary would not be a bad thing. I would see that as a positive in many ways. So I don't know. I mean, and I think I probably was in support of this the first time around. My personal inclination is to allow it, but with some of the caveats and you know, stipulations that you guys have outlined here. I agree with some of these, and maybe we do it more on a trial basis. But it doesn't seem like it's been a problem in the 4 years. And so I don't know. I don't know that it's something that we need to put the hammer down on it at this point, because personally, I like food trucks. I think a lot of people like to have those options, those food trucks. I don't want to, you know, disadvantage our brick and mortar, but I think it does bring actually some character to the community by having those types of options. Again, as long as they're temporary and they're properly regulated. So that's just my opinion.
Others?
Yeah,
You know,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Mike.
In Ted's line of thought, I tend to agree with him, but and I think though that what is temporary and what is too long. So you look at World Liquor, they've had a permanent food truck for 2 years or something. It's moved out maybe, you know, a few days here and there, but literally, I don't know if it's been more than a handful of days. It's not been there over a 2-year period. Now it's used. And people are always going to it, and so I agree with Ted. It does add a little, you know. I wish it wasn't adding to the World Liquor look, but it does add to kind of that, you know, feel and such. But again, when is too long for even that food truck to have been there every single day? And then this one down there did catch me off guard. It snuck in over the winter, I think it was, if I remember. And I started seeing it there down at that ruined property. And with that one, Doug, they don't fall under any of these. They don't have restrooms, you know, or they do have adequate access to fire and police, but no restrooms for people and such. I suppose if it was lucrative enough, though, they'd bring in a Kaibo, and won't that add to the look, you know, on 86th Street. But
Mr. McCoy, the food truck that we're talking about there on 86th Street does actually have an agreement with their neighbor to utilize their restrooms.
What neighbor? The tire or the?
Yeah, CarX.
All right.
Wow.
Well, I think so as we look at this site specifically, I thought Matthew brought up a really great point, and that is, well, what if we had 20 food trucks on that site? So I think, and I think we've got to think about that.
It'd be a cool look for
a
2
weekend.
days.
Yeah.
Yeah, or like
something that's temporary. I actually think that would add some character. But again, yeah, it may be for a weekend or a festival or something like that, but not on an ongoing basis, obviously.
Right.
Yeah, and I agree with a lot what's being said right here, and I agree it does add the flavor. I think we need to look at this in a holistic approach where, you know, if we have regulation with this and we're able to look at this as a temporary situation, I think it does add value. I think to say that, you know, there could be 50 or 60 units on here, I think the market's going to decide eventually how many, you know, food trucks would be on any lot. Look, if you have 50 or 60 on there, you're not going to have the business to support that. So I think that's a bit far-fetched. Could there be 4, 5, 6 on there? I don't know, perhaps. And could that be on a weekend or as we regulate that for a specific instance? Possibly. But I think we need to tighten the regulations, and I think we need to look at these on an individual basis.
Other comments?
Your Honor, one thing I would also offer just for consideration if the council's looking for ways to manage this if for allowance on a vacant lot. I think the adjacency of that vacant lot also makes a difference. For example, this lot is within a certain amount of feet of the trail system. And so that, in this, particularly the summer months, and thinking about how we activate, you know, the Greenbelt Trail a little bit more. And part of the reason behind the original food truck ordinance was, how do we find ways to get things like food trucks closer to the trail system, where floodplains or floodways may make it harder for brick and mortar to get close to those users. And so there could be some consideration too of, in terms of its adjacency to the trail system, that may where you might want to have, you know, flexibility on a vacant lot, for example, like this location, which is directly adjacent to a trailhead, where particularly during the summer months where you have that activity, maybe there's 1 or 2 allowed, and then maybe it's, you know, restrictive during other times of the year. Just something that I wanted to offer up to think about.
Matt, that's a good point. And when we worked on the Greenbelt Master Plan a number of years ago, that was a key consideration of how to bring more traffic and more amenities to the trail, and food trucks or those type of options were included in our discussions.
Well, they certainly were, and and now we're starting to see some things come to fruition. I still think we're very much in the test phase of food trucks in our community. It's going to take us several years to kind of work through that. I'm hearing a lot of themes here, and if I may, and it seems like that there's consensus that we want food trucks in the community. We desire them. We need to control the process, however. And if there's a questionable location like vacant lots, that we're heavily involved in that decision-making process up front before it's allowed with staff, and I don't think that's unreasonable. So I'll stop there and invite other questions or comments.
Your Honor, I'll just circle back to some of the other comments that have already been made, but just to reinforce the idea, I think the consensus is that we want a little more regulation of this. We're not opposed to having a food truck there on occasion for a very limited period, but if we're hearing the owner's signed a lease, that sounds like a longer duration than perhaps what most of us are comfortable with. So sounds like the direction is figuring out how to properly regulate that. Again, as suggested, a weekend event with multiple food trucks probably is okay, but not something long-standing.
Yeah, indeed.
What I would offer, Your Honor, is based on that kind of, if the council's, it sounds like consensus on that direction, staff will take that back and we'll craft something that reflects that and share that with all of you. And I think we can definitely come up with something that strikes that balance that Mayor Pro Tem Edwards talked about. I think the temporary nature, or taking a trial period of this, maybe for this summer or this year, I think is a good first step. And then we can kind of see how it goes. And if we see it's only 1 or 2 vacant lots and it's only 1 or 2 vendors and it's reasonable, then maybe we continue it. I think one of the keys maybe to get at some of Doug's concerns too for some of these properties is not letting, for example, a lease be longer than 12 months or longer than 6 months. So we're not necessarily creating that long-term encumbrance or restriction of future redevelopment, that there is a temporary nature or a time expiration, if you will. And if we're starting to see, and also if the council's starting to see problems with a particular property because they're not abiding by rules, or we need to put a kind of the heavier regulation on it, then we can basically say your next permit isn't going to be approved, your next year, your next time, whatever that time period is. And then it also offers the council flexibility to make adjustments as you see fit.
So could we look at something like they have to move and can they stay overnight for the next day already? And
they cannot.
That is actually currently in our ordinance, they are supposed to move every night.
Okay. And then can they come, maybe something about, you can't be at the same location for X days in a row, right? Even if you come back the next morning and you're there for a year, it's not really a mobile food truck anymore.
Yeah, it's a good point.
You know?
I think that I would add, Michael, to your comment that maybe the time allowed to stay is in smaller increments, but very easily renewable if things are working out or if the circumstances based on the location are doing well, not causing a problem. But I think we got to give ourselves room to work in regulating to where we can't say, well, if we're having a problem with somebody and while they're in, their time frame is 6 months or a year, and we're having issues at 2 months, it's going to be a long time period before their next renewal. So I just think we need to consider that.
One item that we haven't talked about much as well is,
if I may, just stated the true spirit of what a mobile food truck is. And I think that's what Michael was saying, and I would agree.
one item I would offer, Your Honor, is for consideration is the restroom aspect. And in this particular situation, they've made an agreement with an adjacent tenanted, building that had a permanent physical restroom space. Is there a desire to see parameters put around so you don't have multiple kaibos or temporary restroom situations? I just go back to Councilmember Edwards' comment on a past discussion related to kaibos, and that kind of comes up in my memory, and related to whether or not that is something that you want us to consider in these guidelines as well, in terms of having a physical access to a physical restroom versus temporary.
I think the longer they're there, we would prefer that they have access to a permanent facilities. The shorter they're there, a kaibo isn't going to be as unsightly or problematic. If it's just a weekend or a festival or something like that, but if they're there for 6 months and the kaibo's sitting there for 6 months, it doesn't add to the vibrancy that we're trying to achieve.
To your previous point, they shouldn't be there for 6 months, right? That's not mobile then at that point.
Well, I know I just use that as an example, but
just had me confused there.
Because on the Kaibo deal, then how would you have the Weaver Friday Food Fest or his private party he got going? That's what started this whole thing, was that party he started over in the park. Weaver Family Friday Food Truck or something, and they use Kaibos.
Well, so I think I think there's a lot of consensus here in the direction. Let's keep to the spirit of mobile food trucks. Let's understand. Let's give ourselves the opportunity to regulate and have strong communication on the front side, and not putting ourselves in a situation where we've got long-term situations going on. We need to be in control of that, and I think I'm hearing consensus from everyone in your comments. So I think, staff, if that gives you ample information to go back with as you recraft our ordinance, and a great discussion here tonight. Is there anything else on this item?
I think that gives us guidance to, if not recraft the ordinance, but maybe come up with a policy that we can employ. We'll come up with something. We'll bring it back to council and see if it's acceptable. Yeah, you've given us a lot to think about, so I appreciate it.
And Matthew, if I'm correct, isn't it this portion on the vacant land an administrative function too, where it wouldn't necessarily require a change in the ordinance itself?
Correct. The way it's written in the ordinance right now is an administrative function. So that's why we wanted the guidance to make sure that when we are faced with these decisions, we're making the right kind of decisions. So I think what would be appropriate is for us to draft up kind of a policy that is our own in-house policy that we can look at and refer to when we're faced with these kinds of decisions. So I appreciate the council's guidance on this.
Great. We'll look forward to next steps. Thank you, Matthew. Mm-hmm. All right. The second discussion item is regarding single-family residential occupancy. And Amanda, take us through that one.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening again. Can everyone see my screen now?
Yes.
With the PowerPoint? Okay, great. Had a few challenges with screen share lately. Sorry about that. So today we are going to discuss specifically single family residential occupancy, largely related to the rental units that we have in single family homes. So I'm going to start by giving you guys some background, and then some of the alternatives we've looked at, and then get into kind of the meat of the two kind of ideas that staff has that we think are viable. So for a little bit of background as a refresher, effective January 1st of 2018, the state of Iowa passed legislation that preempted local rental regulations. That legislation specifically said you can no longer regulate based on familial relationships. I believe our code before said no more than 3 unrelated persons could live together and be considered a family. That's pretty standard language that was used throughout many communities and had been a long upheld legal way to regulate occupancy in rental units. There are multiple Supreme Court cases going back to at least the 70s that kind of established this case history, and that had largely become the standard way of regulating rental occupancies, particularly in those single family areas. So at that time, end of 2017, beginning of 2018, Clive had to update our definitions for family in the zoning and building codes to come into compliance with what is specifically a now Iowa law that says we cannot regulate rentals differently for people who are related versus unrelated. At that time, in 2018, we did not make any changes to the dwelling occupant load table. We did look at that as an option, but council was concerned with having an impact on existing households and families and multi-generational homes and people with children and your college student coming back to live with you and some of those kinds of considerations, that tweaking those dwelling occupant loads could have had an impact on people. So since 2018, when we made our change to those family definitions, we have had some complaints from what is at least a perceived overoccupancy in some single family rentals. I say perceived overoccupancy because it is not exceeding, in any instances that staff has investigated, those occupancies are not exceeding the allowed dwelling occupant load table. And that is what is kind of our baseline that is backed up by our rental housing program, building code standards, and some of those things is what would be like an overcrowding standard. Generally, most of the complaints that we receive are related to things like illegal parking and nuisances. There are a few cases where there have been things like domestic assaults or arguing, fighting, things of that nature, but they're primarily related to those nuisance and parking related complaints. So here is the current dwelling occupant load table. You guys can see that for reference. That is also included in your staff report. I won't go through this entirely tonight. And our current requirements are then based on the actual dwelling characteristics. That table breaks down 3 different sizes of bedrooms and allows 1, 2, or 3 people, depending on the size of those bedrooms, to be counted for each room. Plus allows up to 2 multi-purpose rooms in any home. So that could be your family room, living room, den, things of those nature, as long as they meet some other standards that are laid out in the code with emergency exiting and the minimum square footages and things of that nature. So our current requirements, again, would be largely supported by other codes like the International Building Code. And it's a clearly defensible public interest in limiting overcrowding and protecting safety and general welfare. But since we have got those complaints, council directed us to look at some alternatives. So we really looked at 7 kind of main categories of alternatives. The first 5 I will run through fairly quickly for you guys because we don't really see that those are great options. And we had also looked at them back in 2017, 2018 before we made the change. And at that point, we didn't want to pursue any of those options. So the first one was modifying that dwelling occupant load table. as I kind of already said, what could be the cons of that. The pros are it's easy to calculate, and it would be very similar to our current requirement, just a bit more restrictive. The second alternative is just setting a flat maximum persons per dwelling. So rather than taking it back to the specifics of how many bedrooms and what size are those bedrooms for this house, it would simply say, we don't care what size your house is, you can never have more than X number of people in your dwelling. Again, that's very easy to calculate. It's easy to understand, and you get very predictable results with that. However, it is more difficult to write a regulation like that because there are a lot of questions of what criteria do you pick for a number if the size of the house and those characteristics of the house aren't what's defining that. You know, what is, are we just making up a number? Kind of how do you arrive to that? Again, concern with adverse impacts on multi-generational households and particularly adverse impacts on families with children. The next alternative we looked at was, again, very similar, except instead of maximum persons, it was a maximum number of adults. Largely has the same kind of questions of how do you really pick a number if you're not looking at the characteristics there. You know, you could have a 1,400 square foot house with 3 bedrooms and say, okay, 3 adults are allowed. But then if you had a 3,600 square foot house with 6 bedrooms, but still only 3 adults could live there, you know, it starts to raise the question of how did we arrive at those regulations and are they really defensible? The fourth alternative we looked at would be to require a certain amount of shared habitable space based on the number of bedrooms. So for instance, you would need, we'll just say 100 square feet of shared living space for each bedroom. So if you had a 3-bedroom house, you would have to have 300 square feet within like a living room, dining room type area that was not divided into bedrooms. That of course could be useful because it would limit the ability to create additional bedrooms in single family homes. However, it could also lead to being fairly inefficient use of space. It could also incentivize people to make additions to houses that aren't really necessary or well utilized, which would then of course lead to additional impervious surface and stormwater impacts from that. It can again also have adverse impacts on families with children or multi-generational households, since typically they would want more bedrooms so they could have more of their own space. The fifth alternative we looked at was a maximum number of persons per off-street parking that would be available, kind of trying to get at the real complaint that these frequently are, which is that illegal parking. This does specifically target that complaint-driven item. However, it doesn't actually stop anyone from parking on the street, even if they had adequate on-site parking. It wouldn't do anything to limit the number of vehicles that somebody could own. It doesn't help, you know, if you have teenagers who drive and block mom and dad in, so they park somewhere else. You know, there's a lot of things that it doesn't really address with those. So those are the 5 alternatives we looked at and didn't really think they do a lot to solve the problem that we're seeing. So I will pause there for a second and just see if anyone had questions on any of those before I move into the next alternative, which is looking at some modifications to our rental program based on the International Building Codes related to lodging houses. So that's really going to be the meat of the conversation. So I'll just pause for a second if anyone has any questions about the background or any of these alternatives.
Question?
Your Honor, I have one quick question.
That's Susan.
And that is, how do you know if a home is being used for a rental or if there are a lot of family members there? Or I'm just curious about that.
Sure. So we are at the population threshold where the state requires us to have a rental housing program. So within the city, anyone who is renting their property is supposed to register those with us. There's inspections that go along with that to make sure that the properties are safe and, you know, meeting those kinds of requirements, that they're habitable for people. Typically, we wouldn't know if you had a lot of people living there unless there's a problem where you're generating complaints. So that one is kind of up to people being honest, largely, when they fill out that information and then being good neighbors. If you're doing those things, we're not going to just come knock on everyone's door all the time and ask how many people are living there.
Yeah, I have a feeling we have one of these out in Country Club, but I don't know how anybody would know it, or if there's been an application for a permit or anything. So just in terms of identifying the problem, that seems to me it could be one that we don't always know, the actual use of the property.
Other questions, council?
Yeah, I guess, we talk about the parking problem and that's usually the complaint. And I would get that. I understand it. It would be kind of the beginning, and a lot of our code is based off complaint basis, right? Like we don't go around and check until we get complaints from others or neighbors. But there's got to be something that is hard facts, and I'm not putting Weaver on the spot. Maybe staff knows this answer, but that it is going to affect the neighbor's values directly if the house next to them is cut up into 7 bedrooms, all being rented out individually, regardless if they got a renter permit or not, right? I'm not saying we can regulate that, but that's just got to be a fact in itself. And as I told you all, my neighbor, third highest bid or second highest bid, was for a company that's coming into Clive and openly told him, we are looking to buy multiple houses in this area to do this.
Yes, I think Councilman McCoy, what you're talking about really gets into that next alternative we're going to dive into in a lot more detail.
Okay.
So that's a perfect segue if anyone else doesn't have questions.
Go ahead, Amanda, proceed.
Great. So thank you for setting that up for me, Councilman. So the next alternative we really looked at is it's not currently contemplated in our rental housing program, but would be to enforce the International Building Code's lodging house and boarding house provisions. So I'll start by giving a couple definitions here. A lodging house, by definition, has to have a primary occupant that is permanent in nature. So when we read that at a staff level, we've said, okay, it has to be owner occupied. That's the first step to be considered a lodging house. The second part of that is it allows up to a total of 5 rooms. So in reading that, we believe the interpretation of the code would be 1 for the owner, and then they could rent up to 4 bedrooms to other people. And a maximum allowance would be for 10 occupants. So that could fall under the International Building Code lodging house.
And
So
that's
the
regardless
next,
of the size of the home?
that would be regardless of the size.
Okay, gotcha.
So the next kind of logical question there then is, okay, what if I want to rent out 5 rooms to people, but I don't want to live there as the property owner? You would not be a lodging house. You would then fall under what is defined as a boarding house, which is the broader definition that is any building arranged or used for lodging for compensation and not occupied as a single family unit. So that differs from an apartment since you're not technically creating separate dwellings. Your boarding house would not necessarily have a bathroom and a kitchen and a sleeping facility for every tenant. The bathrooms and kitchens would be shared in that situation, particularly the kitchen, sometimes also the bathroom. So our first step here would be first option for you guys would be to modify our rental housing program to include regulations for lodging houses specifically. So we think that's really coming back to the properties we have had complaints on, like Councilman McCoy brought up. It's companies that are coming in and renting out by the bedroom rather than renting the dwelling as a whole. So in this situation, if we go this route and modify the rental housing program to have specifics related to lodging houses in it, You could have a rental property that was a single family home that you rented under one lease. You could have the lodging house where you lived in it and then rented bedrooms to multiple possible tenants. Sorry, I have some graphics I should be showing you. Let's step back a minute. So you could have the simple as an owner occupied single family home. In this case, we've broke down the bedroom sizes. Those relate back to our dwelling occupant load table. So our little cartoon house here with these specifications could have a permitted occupant load of 10 persons. This little blue family can all live together in this house, 10 people together. That would be an owner occupied home. So this would be me, my husband, and our 8 children, or some other iteration of family living together. Or it could be me and 9 of my best friends that all got the same loan and live in the house together. The next example would be if you're an owner occupied single family house and you wanted to have the ability to rent out those rooms as a lodging house. Same cartoon house, same specs here, also permitted occupant load of 10 people. That number happens to correspond with that maximum of 10 that the International Building Code brings up. So in the case that this house was big enough to fit 15 people, in this scenario, you'd still be capped at that 10 occupants. So say there was 2 more bedrooms in the basement or something that allowed you to have more occupants, you'd still get capped at 10 people in this scenario. So in that case, you could have your family of 9 with just 1 renter that you're renting it out to, because these would be the owner occupants and this would be the 1 lodger. You could have your family of 6 with up to 4 lodgers, each having a different room. Or you could, of course, just be a single occupant owner. You wouldn't necessarily have to have 10 people, of course. We're just showing the maximums in these examples. Does anyone have questions about the lodging house?
I have a quick question for you. And I have a little bit of familiarity with this. I had an employee once that lived in a lodging house, and it was a formula that was duplicated. It was in Johnston. You never know. It was a very nice residential neighborhood. It was a very nice house, but the owner certainly didn't live there. He owned several of these, and they had what he called the managing partner or a managing renter that lived there, that had the bedroom with the master bedroom essentially. And then they had the rest of the bedrooms that were leased out to on a month-to-month basis to various renters. So, under what formula would you classify that? I can promise you that most of these houses, the owner does not want to live there with 5 or 6 strange people that are renting these rooms on a monthly basis.
Absolutely. So there's kind of 2 ways, I guess, we could look at that. We could take the stricter interpretation that says that principally permanent person has to be the owner and structure our rental code, rental housing program to require that. I do think there would be a conversation worth having if that person could be like a temp or a permanent caretaker of the property, for lack of a better word. So a consistent person that lived there all the time. That could be an option that we would have to discuss more at a staff level and really dig into those notes that the IBC includes about how it's intended to be applied. If we determined that, no, you really do have to live there, it absolutely has to be the owner occupant, then that would not qualify as a lodging house. It would fall back to being a boarding house. So that would come down to how we, again, would structure that rental housing program.
Amanda, do you have, so as you talk about the 2, is there, maybe it's not having one or the other, maybe it's having a combination of both, but are you going to get to a point where you're going to have some recommendations on these?
Yes.
Okay, good. Then
It's a little, it took us at the staff level quite a bit to wrap our head around the differences and all the definitions. I just want to make sure as we walk through that please, if any questions do come up, feel free to stop me at any point, but just make sure that those definitions are understandable to you guys, because it is a much more complicated and nuanced way to think about these occupancies. So with that, then I will move on to the next option, a rental occupied single family home. Like I'd mentioned before, same house would have the same permitted occupant load in the dwelling occupant load table. But these 10 people would all sign the same lease, or 2 people, 3 people, 6 people, whatever your household size would be, up to 10. You'd have one lease, but could all live in that house together. So that is not a lodging house. That is not a boarding house. That is simply a single family home that is rented out to be lived in. Where we get to the boarding house, you can see the graphic gets a lot more complicated. It's the same house, the same occupant load, but each of these people, or sets of people in the circle, have their own independent lease. So you can have those separate transactions allowed, essentially. So this is that situation, I believe it was Councilman Klein was describing, where you could not be the owner occupant and you could lease out those bedrooms with those shared kitchen facilities or bathroom facilities, where you would lease those out to those kind of independent households that may or may not know each other, may or may not ever communicate with each other than happening to pass someone in the hallway or in the kitchen. So staff would recommend at this point that we start off with changes to the rental housing program to incorporate this International Building Code ideas about lodging houses and boarding houses, so we can start to implement those limits and restrictions for rentals that register. How that would work is we would we would draft the new program guidelines. We would bring that back to you guys to discuss and make a motion on if you want to approve those. And then for anyone that is currently a registered rental, the new impacts from that change would not come into play until January of 2023, because they have already completed their 2-year rental cycle. However, it would stop anyone who is not currently in the rental program. They would, whenever they, signed up. So if it was the Monday following the council meeting that the new program guidelines are adopted at, those guidelines would be in place for them immediately, because they do not currently have an approved rental certificate. So we would recommend that as the first step. Now, based on how that goes and how we proceed through that process, and if there are continued issues and problems generated by rentals, there is the alternative 7, which we see as really working in tandem with those IBC definitions for boarding and lodging house, which would be to put the boarding and lodging houses potentially back into the permitted uses tables in the zoning ordinance. They were historically in the zoning from at least 1963 until our major zoning update in 2000. In 2000, they were removed because nobody in 2000 was calling them boarding houses and lodging houses anymore. It was a pretty antiquated way to think about your zoning, because we had that Supreme Court case history and that well-established ability to regulate on the number of unrelated persons. The distinctions in your use table just weren't really being used by anyone, so they were taken out. So now that Iowa has specifically made these changes, one option would be to put those back in the use table if we wanted to limit, and for instance, say boarding house should only be allowed in the R3 multifamily residential district because it's more akin to an apartment than it is a single family home. That is something we could pursue putting back into those permitted uses tables.
Council thoughts on that?
Yeah, may I ask a question? Police chief is on. Is he unmuted? How would you, for the police, how do you, I mean, who do you ticket in a case like this, right? The house is unruly. You have multiple leasers or multiple people staying at one dwelling. I mean, how do you even enforce any kind of action at a place like this? Who do you give the ticket to? Who's responsible?
Well, normally, I think what the activities we're being called about are parking issues and disorderly persons. So at this point, we wouldn't be taking any action against any property owner, but it doesn't mean those who are, maybe out consuming alcohol in the street or fighting behaviors or things like that. We've had at these places before. We would have to take action based on the actions that the officers observe or witnesses observe.
Like we had that big party out there out west. I remember the last name, but I won't say it. Where the parents, shut the doors and the party continued or what have you. You go after the owners of the house. In this case, I'm a bit confused on who would even be responsible.
Yeah, at this point, I don't have a good answer for you.
Okay.
We don't have a social host kind of ordinance that would cover those sorts of parties, but that other situation involved underage folks, so it was a little bit of a different bent there.
Sure.
So Amanda, I get why we want to use this code. I mean, it makes sense, but I'm not sure that, and I support it, by the way, but I'm not sure it's going to solve some of the problems that we're trying to solve, like the parking, for example. I don't know that this resolves any of that, right? I mean, or am I missing something?
It's certainly not a silver bullet. Our silver bullet kind of went away when the state changed their regulations, unfortunately. So it is one of the options that's available to us to help mitigate some of that impact. For instance, the lodging house, maybe those are allowed in single family neighborhoods once we're all through this. But then you're only having, 4 other units instead of 7, 8, 9, 10, kind of however many bedrooms you can cram people into.
I see. So you're saying for like typical neighborhoods, we would allow a lodging house, but not a boarding house.
That could be an option, yes.
Which would make sense to me. Okay. All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just interject here. I think we need to move as quickly as we can on working out something with the international code. I believe staff said they could get something to us in 30 days, and I think they should do that. And then concurrently with that, since it apparently takes about 6 months, is to also look at the zoning side of things. The question is this something we want in our community? What we're seeing and what's over on our side of town, I think the answer is no. We don't want houses being chopped up into 7 rooms and having cars all over the streets and all the other problems. There's also, at least for me, a fire safety issue. And Amanda, maybe you can address how are we sure that these 7, 10, 12, whatever number of residents are in a safe place?
Yeah, absolutely. I can touch on that a little bit. So for the safety aspects of it, as long as those properties are registered as rentals, which I know at least of one in your neighborhood that is registered through the program. So they did have to go through the inspection to verify that they were meeting those life safety issues that are established through the rental housing program. So from that standpoint, the home has been determined to be safe. You mentioned like fire concerns, things of that nature. That is a good question. For instance, if I have a family and I have my husband and 4 kids, I know that there's 6 of us in an emergency, and when we're leaving, I make sure that there's 6 bodies with me outside, or I know to get help for someone who's inside. In some of these situations where the house has been chopped up, you have people that don't know each other. They might not even know how many people are living in the home with them. If there's not a caretaker or an owner occupant that knows who those people are, they don't know if everyone's out safe. They can't provide good information. They can't really provide aid or help anybody in those situations. So there definitely is some concerns when you start to get those large occupancies, which is why there is that cap on the total number of occupants and that dwelling occupant load table. Those are the kind of things that the International Code Council has looked at when they've come up with those base requirements with the 10 persons, 5 occupants, those kinds of considerations that are in their codes.
Amanda, do you have more slides?
I do not. This is the last one.
The last one, okay. Well, I concur with John's comments. We need to move this forward. I think there's been good discussion and questions, and obviously if there's more, we want to make sure that we get them. But to move this forward and come back to us with recommendations on what is appearing to be a fairly complicated aspect of our community. So we'll look forward to that. Councilor, are there other questions or comments for Amanda tonight?
Your Honor, if I could, just to clarify from staff's perspective, so is it a consensus of the council to, related to Councilmember Edwards' comment, to have staff work on the IBC, the building code angle, and the zoning code in concurrence, or is it both, or is it the building code angle first? I just want to make sure that we're, working towards what the council desires here.
I would think that we would be working on both of them at the same time. And if through your research activities determined that really the zoning aspect really can't work into this to make a viable recommendation to the council, then you advise us.
And Amanda, am I correct? The building code angle of this would likely obviously be the faster piece, and then the zoning ordinance aspect would definitely go through planning and zoning for evaluation and recommendation as well.
Yes, absolutely. And we've actually started, as you all know, we adopted the new general regulations chapter. Working through the district chapters was the next kind of item on the checklist for us. So we have started the initial process of working on those. So depending on how those conversations go, could be 6 months, could be a little longer, but we are currently working through those chapters. So now would be a time to have conversations around those kinds of changes you'd want to see in those land use tables.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions, council? Amanda, thank you. We will look forward to your follow-up. Doug, thank you as well. And we will anxiously move forward with solid recommendations. So again, thank you. Okay, council, we're going to move to reports. And Pete, I'm going to start at your end.
Thank you, Your Honor. With the action the council has taken tonight, we'll have wonderful storytelling to do tomorrow about the upcoming budget. Coming back also to some of the CIP highlights, the rate changes for the utilities, and then the AAA bond rating and the unbelievable rates that we received as a city to execute on these projects. So please watch for that across the city's various communication platforms. Last week, I was out, but we had done some pre-work to get a couple of really positive stories. One was about the GOAT program in the Des Moines Register, and the other was about the public safety building under construction. Chiefs did a nice job working with the Register reporter, telling a very compelling story, and again, making the same case that was made back during the lost vote and when the property was originally purchased, that this is something the city's been working on for a long time and is getting it right and right-sizing it for what our community needs from first responders now, but also what we'll need from them for decades to come. A couple of big mail pieces were in mailboxes across the city over the last 2 weeks. One is the Clive Connected magazine. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to flip through it. This is our spring summer guide, and our Parks Department did a wonderful job putting together a very concise and compelling piece. The Chamber Directory also came out in about the same period of time. It's also looking very nice. We appreciate that work done by our friends at the Chamber and really appreciate their outreach to the city so that we get a chance to talk about some of the services and amenities that the city provides for businesses and residents. The other one that's coming up that is going out, either went out today or is going out tomorrow, is what has become an annual publication the ComDev department puts out called Be Flood Ready. This is tied to our community rating system, but more probably important than that, it's just tied to our commitment to continuing to let residents know what their risk is or help them understand their risk and understand some of the things they can do to mitigate that flood risk as well. At this point, Matt would tell me to knock on wood because we're not going to hopefully have to stress too much about that this season, but we know that it is always a possibility as we live here on the banks of Walnut Creek. Next week on Tuesday, we will have our Clark Street pre-construction meeting with residents who live immediately adjacent to the construction area for phase 2 of Clark Street reconstruction. That runs from roughly where construction ended last summer, so right up to about 105th, the little cul-de-sac bulb there, and then moving west in direction of 114th, not all the way up to 114th. Within that area, there are a number of subsections that are set up, and that's for making sure we keep access for the neighborhood as available as possible. But just like there was during the first Clark Street phase, there'll be moments during construction when some people will just not have access to their driveway and need to have some arrangements for garbage, mail, and so forth. Jim has done a wonderful job, just as he did last summer, along with his Public Works colleagues, to make sure we communicate all these nuts and bolts to neighbors. And if it's like last year, which we expect, we'll have a really well executed project and also a number of chances to make to follow through on our promises and earn trust with the neighbors as we get a much better piece of infrastructure out there in front of their homes. Finally, a couple other projects that we're working on right now that involve some key partners in town. One that I've mentioned before, we're working with Crestview School of Inquiry on some Lenan Park redesign concepts. This is tied to our 86th Street Neighborhoods project. And it's also just tied to our annual desire to be engaged with the school and their families. The students are working right now after having surveyed their neighbors and their families and their classmates. They're now starting to work on some of their concepts. We're also going to later this week or early next week work with the school district, West Des Moines, or schools, to put a video together really highlighting the success of this project as an example of project-based learning, but then also as just a good collaboration between a couple of really important community institutions, the City of Clive and West Des Moines schools. So we look forward to working with them on that video. Finally, we've had some wonderful opportunities to engage with Congresswoman Axney's office over the past few days. You may have seen the news that the House of Representatives is resurrecting something like an appropriations process or an earmark process. These are now called community-based projects. And the Congresswoman had reached out to us asking the city to come up with some concepts, some ideas that might be a good fit for this program. So the mayor, Matt, and I, in addition to other key staff, are generating those ideas and we'll be refining them further to see if they're a good fit for some of our projects this year. The important thing to note about that, two things. First off, the Senate is still sort of coming up with their game plan for how they might resurrect this process. And two, if it's like past examples, this project, even if you don't get your project 1 year, it's not a loss. There are many, many years here that these things need to be cultivated to find the right timing, to find the right spot, to find the right piece of legislation to move it forward. So even if we don't land something every time we go into this process, there's great value in continuing to tell the story so that we're prepared for that year when it does come our way.
Pete, thank you. A lot of great things going on. Council, questions for Pete? Pete, thank you. Okay, we'll move Ted to you next.
Nothing tonight, Mayor.
Okay, sir. Eric.
Yeah, the Community Advisory Committee meeting for District 1 was held, and they're continuing to move forward with recommendations for District 1.
Thank you, Eric. That is a robust process that continues to move forward very well. So thanks, Amanda. I know you're still on. John, we'll go to you next.
Nothing for me tonight.
John, thank you. Just a couple of points from my end. So we have Personnel Committee meeting tomorrow. John, Ted, myself, Matt, Roxanne, and plenty before us. Matt warned us that this will take at least an hour and a half. So we're preparing for that, and we'll look forward to covering the items that we have. Tomorrow also, Matt, myself, Richard, and Susan certainly will be a part of this process. We'll be at the Clive Community Foundation board meeting, and a good portion of this board meeting will be spent with Matt, Richard, and our friends with the Great Outdoors Foundation, reviewing with the Clive Community Foundation the triad projects, our partnership to fundraise and move these projects forward over the years, as we start to resurrect now our public engagement processes as it relates to the project. So very excited about that. And at the same time, the Clive Chamber will be conducting a virtual talk with legislators, and Polk County Supervisor Robert Brownell will be participating in that as well. Mayor Pro Tem Edwards will be welcoming everybody to that event, and helping lead that event. So John, thank you for that. And I would encourage any of you to engage on that discussion, that virtual discussion, tomorrow at noon. And Pete talked about Congresswoman Axney and our opportunities there. So we'll look forward to updating the council on the results of that call on Monday. That's all I have. Are there any questions for me before I pass it along here? Susan, you're next.
I have nothing this evening, Your Honor.
Susan, thank you. Michael?
I have nothing as well.
Madam Council?
Nothing, Your Honor. Thank you.
You're welcome. Matt?
Thank you, Your Honor. Just a couple items tonight, and just to follow up on the mayor's comment about the Personnel Committee. The council can also expect some communications here in the near term regarding the kind of evaluation process for me, and we will be involved survey and interviews this year, doing that on kind of an every other year basis with my executive coach team and through the Personnel Committee. So I'll have some more communication specifically coming to the council out about that tomorrow. Also, tomorrow morning, our city lobbies and library will be reopening to the public for coming into the facility with face coverings still required. I was on a call earlier this week, a Greater Des Moines Partnership call where they had an economist, and he was sharing some data that is out there that Iowa is likely to reach herd immunity related to COVID-19 by August of this year. So Iowa is progressing well in the vaccination process in our state, and so he was sharing that information, so I wanted to share that with all of you. Just a reminder for the next regular city council meeting on April 8th, we are starting a little early, 30 minutes early at 5:30 to have the University Corridor presentation right away from the beginning, just to accommodate some schedules there. So appreciate the council's flexibility on that. Also, a week after that at 5:30 on April 15th, we have our scheduled tour, very involved tour of the status of the Public Safety Center. And earlier tonight, you all approved the last round of funding for that facility, and you will get to see quite a bit on the 15th in terms of the work that's been done out there. And now we just need some sunshine to dry out some of the mud, and we can get some paving going here, hopefully in the coming months for the site itself. But the building is up, roof is on, and they're doing a lot of pavement of the floor and doors as we speak. Also want to share my appreciation with Metro Waste Authority. They are doing their compost donation program again this year. And our parks staff definitely utilize that every year for our planting beds. So that's the more finer kind of compost that are great for planting beds. Of course, we will be promoting this spring that we have a very large and substantial wood chip pile still for our residents to take advantage of. And so we'll definitely be promoting that to start working at the derecho pile. And we've added to it a little bit with some of our other projects like the Greenbelt Vegetation Management Program. Lastly, and this was kind of related to a comment from Representative Conforst, the beginning of the meeting, there was a tax bill that was introduced. It was introduced on Tuesday, a subcommittee was held on Wednesday, and it was sent through committee today. So unfortunately, pretty much being thrown through the process at the legislature. This is on the Senate side. And this bill is kind of a tax omnibus bill related to mental health funding and does include a phase out of the backfill. Essentially, the way I understand it is the bill is essentially removing the backfill to help fund mental health. So it's putting cities in a tough position of kind of pairing those two things together, unfortunately. But there is a 4-year phase out and a 6-year phase out of the backfill, depending on how much the community, the city, or the county has grown over about a 6-year period. And it caps at about if a community has grown, its tax base has grown by over 31.14% over a 6-year period, that they will have a faster phase out, a 4-year phase out versus a 6-year phase out. So with our growth being a suburban community, we are definitely in the 4-year phase out category. And that reduction of the backfill, at least the way the legislation is written today, would not start until the next budget. So the budget you just approved, it wouldn't impact. It would be July 1, 2022, and then starting for 4 years from there. So just to give the council an idea, in this budget, as Representative Conforst referred to, we have about $500,000, a little over $500,000 of backfill that comes into the 3 different levies that the city has, the general fund, debt service, and trust and agency levy. That reduction would be about $132,000 a year across those 3 levies, and specifically $92,000 for the general fund. Regarding those cities that'll be on the fast track or the 4-year phase out, that's about 28% of cities in Iowa. So of course, it is about this time of year when you start to see this heavy legislation related to taxes, and where we've seen a lot of property tax bills or TIF bills come out. A little unfortunate that it's moving this fast through the process. Basically almost getting ready for debate on the Senate floor within 2 days. And there was, I did attend the subcommittee on Wednesday morning, virtual via Zoom very briefly, and there was a large number of people on that call sharing their questions and concerns with the bill. There's a lot of pieces to it. It's actually been renumbered now. It's now Senate File 587, and I'll share that in my weekly email tomorrow. So anyway, we will keep our legislators apprised of that. And I did mention to Representative Conforst before the meeting that I wasn't sure if there would be a companion bill on the House side, and for her to watch out for that. But we'll be sharing that information out with all of you, and definitely concerned on whether the state, in a year where they're, as Representative Conforst referred to, that the budget is in great shape for the state of Iowa, that they're choosing to go back on their commitment to fully fund the backfill from previous years. So anyway, that's where I'll leave my comments at this point, and be happy to answer any questions the council may have.
Thank you, Matt. Council questions or comments for Matt? A lot of material, a lot going on. Well, hearing none, thank you, Matt. Matthew, any additional correspondence?
We do not have anything additional.
Thank you, Matthew. Council, anything else? Council staff, anything else for the good of the order? Seeing none, we're going to adjourn at 8:09 p.m. Thank you all. Have a great, safe weekend. I think it's going to warm up for us.